Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. My name is Brian Ullman. Remember to subscribe to the Chronicle at gemstate.substack.com. Free subscribers get daily posts in their email, while paid subscribers not only support my work, but they get bonus notes, exclusive content, and early access to things like this podcast. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Lynn Bradescu of the Boise Realty Group, who is this month's sponsor. If you're buying or selling, check out BoiseRealtyGroup.com and tell them that you came from the Chronicle. If you own a small business and would like to sponsor the Gem State Chronicle, reach out to me at editor@gemstatechronicle.com. Today I want to turn my attention to some national news because it does affect us all. After President Joe Biden's very sad performance in his debate with Donald Trump, many Democrats are starting to panic. After months, years even, of gaslighting the American people to believe that Biden is fine, just fine, Democrat operatives and their media allies could no longer ignore the truth that our president is not all there. Republicans have been spitballing ideas for who could replace Biden for years, but now Democrats have joined the game. The New York Times editorial board published a piece the day after the debate calling on Joe to step down, and talking heads on CNN and MSNBC have been scrambling for options. Here's the thing, though. I don't think the Democrats have any options. Republicans have long assumed that someone else will take the mantle in 2024, whether it's California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, former First Lady Michelle Obama. A few years ago, before he fell from grace, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was a popular option. The problem with all these options is that Democrats can't simply swap in a new candidate like it's a pinch hitter in a baseball game. First, we have to recognize there are two parallel issues here. Biden is two things. He's both the sitting president as well as the Democratic nominee for president. If he's not competent for one, he shouldn't be the other, but simply removing him from either position is actually really difficult. Let's address the office of president first. Short of Biden dying or resigning, the only way to remove him is by invoking Section 4 of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. Allow me to read the section in full. It's a little bit long. Quote, "Whenever the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of other such body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. Thereafter, when the President transmits to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office, unless the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department or of such other body as Congress may by law provide transmit within 4 days to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, or, if Congress is not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote of both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall resume the powers and duties of his office." End quote. All that is to say is that if the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet decide that the President's incapacitated, they can remove him from power temporarily. However, the President can respond and say he's not, in fact, incapacitated. At that point, it goes to Congress and would take a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. As you can see, removal via the 25th Amendment is tremendously unlikely. It's never been done before, which is why I think few lawmakers would be willing to take such a radical step, even if half the cabinet were to get on board. A little bit of background here. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967. The idea for it had come from a series of memos between President Dwight Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon during the 1950s, when Ike had suffered a heart attack. Nixon unofficially assumed the duties of acting president, but stopped short of anything official, so as far as anyone was concerned, Eisenhower was still in charge. Section 1 of the amendment simply says that the vice president succeeds to the presidency if the president dies, resigns, or is removed from office via impeachment. That has happened once since that ratification, when Nixon resigned in 1974. Section 2 says that if the office of vice president ever becomes vacant, the president shall appoint a replacement, who must then be confirmed by a majority vote in both houses of Congress. This has happened twice, both times within a year of each other, ironically. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned in 1973, so Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to take his place. Then, when Ford became president upon Nixon's resignation, he appointed Nelson Rockefeller to the now vacant position of vice president. Section 3 of the 25th Amendment says that the President can write a letter to the Speaker of the House and the Pro Tem of the Senate declaring that he will be incapacitated for a certain period, during which time the Vice President assumes the duties of acting President. This is usually done for certain medical procedures such as colonoscopies in which the President's under anesthesia. When Biden had his colonoscopy in 2021, Kamala Harris was acting President for a whole 85 minutes. So you can see that Section 4 is the only part of the 25th Amendment that's never been tried, which makes it unlikely that anyone will actually be willing to invoke it. You'll hear people talking about it, but actually doing it is a very big step. That means that Biden stays president until he decides he's done, and there's no indication that he's willing to step down. Who are his strongest supporters, his handlers, in a very literal sense? Jill Biden doesn't want to give up the life of the First Lady. Barack Obama tweeted his support for Biden after the debate, showing that he wants him to stay put as well. One thing you have to realize is that no matter how embarrassing it is to have a doddering fool as our president, it serves some people very well. Every staffer, every political appointee, every hanger-on, they all owe their position and their power to Biden being in the Oval Office. Sometimes we think that the left is a monolith, marching in lockstep, but that's not actually the case. There are numerous factions on that side, each jockeying for power and influence. The New York Times editorial board, by calling on Biden to step down, is showing the position of one of those factions, while Obama's statement that Biden should stay the course represents another. I've seen it suggested that the CNN debate was a deliberate setup by an anti-Biden faction that wanted the president to crash and burn so that he'd be forced to step down. I think this is unlikely for several reasons. First, the people closest to Biden are his biggest supporters: his wife Jill, former Chief of Staff Ron Klain, former President Obama, and several others. They need Biden to stay the course for their own sakes. Second, the debate seemed set up to protect Biden, not harm him. No audience, the muted microphones, all those things were designed to compensate for his weaknesses. I don't think anyone expected things to go the way they did. Donald Trump was much more restrained and disciplined than he was in 2020, when the debate kept descending into shouting matches. This restraint contrasted well with Biden's obvious impairment. I think the dominant faction wants Biden in the White House as a figurehead, the glue that holds their power in place. There is precedent for that kind of arrangement. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke which left him bedridden for months. The only people who allegedly saw him were his wife Edith and his personal physician. So who was running the government in 1919 into 1920? Was it Edith Wilson? Vice President Thomas Marshall? Senate Majority Leader Henry Cabot Lodge? House Speaker Frederick Gillette? By mid-1920, Wilson had recovered to the point where he actually thought he could win a third term as president. This was before the 22nd Amendment outlawed such things. You see, it takes a lot of ego to step into the role of President of the United States, and even more humility to step down. However, if Joe Biden were to step down, for the sake of argument, Kamala Harris would immediately assume the office of president, and God help us all. She's even more unpopular than Biden, and the Democrats know this, so this would not really increase their chances of beating Trump in November. Steve Saylor wrote a piece this morning suggesting that if Biden resigns, giving one final good speech, and then Harris gives a serviceable inaugural address, it might be enough to make normal Americans forget that she's nowhere near tall enough for this ride, but I'm skeptical. In any case, that brings us to the second paradigm, the presidential campaign. Joe Biden has already won all the Democrat primaries, so he heads to the DNC in Chicago next August with the nomination in the bag. Delegates are pledged to support him on the first ballot, so there's essentially zero chance of any convention shenanigans. The superdelegate system was reformed after 2016, when many Democrats believed the DNC had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders and gave it to Hillary Clinton. So there's little they can do, at least on the first ballot. The current delegate count is 3,894 for Biden, 4 for Dean Phillips, and 3 for Jason Palmer, with 36 remaining uncommitted. Superdelegates only vote if they go to a second ballot, but that seems impossible since literally 99% of delegates are bound to vote for Joe Biden on the first ballot. Even if Biden were to decline the nomination, LBJ style, it would be hard for Democrats to get around Kamala Harris. Hers is the only other name on the Biden campaign war chest, so she would immediately inherit the lion's share of the money. As vice president, she is the natural successor, even with the recognition that she is extremely unpopular and less than competent. If the Democrats attempted an end run around Harris to support Gavin Newsom or someone else, the cries of racism and sexism would be deafening. How dare you bypass a woman of color, the first female vice president in American history, for another white man? I think the most likely outcome, as of now, is that Biden stays the course. The Democrats prop him up like it's weekend at Bernie's, and then Trump wins in November. While I expect the deep state and the Democrat machine to pull out all the stops to keep Trump from victory, I also see various elements of the deep state pivoting toward Trump. There are many powerful people and groups who, I believe, are making the calculation that they'd have better luck trying to control Trump from within than risk being shut out, and that's a problem we'll have to deal with when we come to it. The second most likely scenario, and that's a very distant second, is that Biden steps down between now and the Democratic National Convention in August. Kamala would become president and would head to Chicago with a mostly united Democrat Party behind her. I think she still loses to Trump, although the media will do their best to shift the narrative to that of a young woman of color versus an old white man, and convicted felon, not to mention. I honestly don't see a path that puts Gavin Newsom or someone else on the ticket. Newsom is a smart political operator, and he has to know his best bet is to wait until 2028, at which point that debate with Ron DeSantis that he had might end up being a presidential preview. Of course, with the way our country's going now, it's entirely likely that things will rapidly and radically change before 2028, so honestly, all bets are off. The one thing that this long episode has demonstrated is that the United States really is a late-stage republic. The Austrian Empire was nearly 1,000 years old at the start of the 20th century, but it entered World War I under the helm of the 84-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ascended to the throne at the age of 18 and saw massive changes over the course of his life. He had no reason to believe that the alliance with Germany, leading into the war, would spell the end of his family's empire, but reality quickly caught up with him, although the emperor himself passed away halfway through the war and did not see the ultimate end. Also consider the USSR. It was near its end by the 1970s, though nobody realized it. Leonid Brezhnev was 11 during Lenin's revolution, and he rose through the ranks to become the number 2 guy under Nikita Khrushchev in the 60s. When Soviet leadership lost confidence in Khrushchev, Brezhnev stepped up to take his place, and he was initially portrayed as a transitionary leader, someone to steady the ship before a new generation could take the reins of power. However, Brezhnev stuck around, even when his mental faculties began declining in the mid-1970s. By the time he died in 1982, the Soviet Union had less than 10 years of existence remaining. The Biden era reminds me of late-stage Austria and USSR. Here you have a man from a previous epoch. Biden was elected to the Senate in 1972. Back then, Richard Nixon was still president, American troops were still engaged in Vietnam, and All in the Family was on American television. The reason the Democrats turned to Biden in 2020 is because they were desperate for anyone to beat Donald Trump. You see, the Democrat Party is a coalition of the fringes, as Steve Saylor calls it. Ethnic minorities, atheists and non-religious people, recent immigrants, LGBTQ plus folks. Their only uniting feature is their hatred of the white Christian American majority. And it's hard to keep such a coalition united. So the only play was to find someone who could evoke nostalgia of a more normal time in America. Joe Biden, by virtue of his long political career, represented exactly that sort of bland, inoffensive nostalgia. Like Brezhnev, Biden claimed at the time that his presidency was meant to be a transitionary period to a new generation of Democratic leaders. Yet where are those leaders now? Where are Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, Gavin Newsom, Hakeem Jeffries, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? The Democrats have a very weak bench right now, which is why Biden is running for a second term in the first place. Like Leonid Brezhnev, like Dianne Feinstein, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like Mitch McConnell, he's going to hang on until the bitter end, no matter what the cost to his party or to his country. As a Republican, I can't say I'm torn up at seeing the opposition implode like this, but as an American, it's just sad. Are we headed for the end, like Austria in 1914, or the Soviet Union in 1975? Or can we right the ship, as America did after Woodrow Wilson's stroke? Warren Harding won a landslide victory in the 1920s on the promise of returning America to normalcy. Is our own next decade going to be another roaring 20s? Or is this the last gasp of a dying country? My name is Brian Ullman, and this has been the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. Remember to follow the show on all the social media platforms and subscribe at gemstate.substack.com, and I'll talk to you next time.